The courtroom was quiet, except for the faint hum of murmured conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. Karoline Leavitt sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She stared straight ahead, trying to focus on the judge's bench but unable to shake the nervous energy coursing through her body. This moment had been months in the making, years even, if she counted all the sleepless nights and endless days spent fighting for justice. Today would be the day it all came to a head. Across the room, Judge Harold Monroe sat stiffly in his chair, his expression unreadable. He was a tall man with sharp features, his gray hair neatly combed back. His reputation for fairness had once been unshakable, but over the past few months that image had started to crack. Accusations of misconduct, favoritism, and abuse of power had surfaced, painting him as someone very different from the impartial figure he claimed to be. And now, here they were. Karoline suing him for $800 million in damages, a staggering amount that reflected not just the harm done but also the sheer scale of his alleged crimes. The jury filed back into the room after hours of deliberation, their faces blank masks. Everyone stood as the judge called the court to order. Karoline felt her heart pounding in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum roll in her ears. She glanced at her lawyer, Rachel Bennett, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. Rachel was calm under pressure, always prepared, and Karoline trusted her completely. But even Rachel's confidence couldn't fully quell the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The foreman of the jury cleared his throat and handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Monroe. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the words silently before looking up at the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "the jury has reached a decision." Karoline held her breath, her fingers digging into the edge of the table. She could feel every eye in the room on her, the reporters scribbling notes, the spectators leaning forward in their seats, and most importantly, Judge Monroe himself, who seemed frozen in place. Finally, the judge spoke again. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Karoline Leavitt. Damages awarded, $800 million. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the room erupted into chaos. Reporters jumped to their feet, shouting questions and snapping photos. Spectators whispered excitedly among themselves while others simply stared in disbelief. Karoline sat perfectly still, letting the weight of the verdict sink in. $800 million. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about proving that no one, not even someone as powerful as Judge Monroe, was above the law. Rachel leaned over and placed a hand on Karoline's shoulder. "You did it," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the noise. Karoline nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She had fought so hard for this moment, sacrificing so much along the way. Now, finally, there was some semblance of justice. Outside, the courthouse, the scene was even more chaotic. Dozens of reporters and photographers crowded around the steps, eager to get a statement from Karoline. Flashbulbs popped nonstop as she emerged, flanked by Rachel and a security guard hired to keep the crowd at bay. Microphones were thrust toward her face and voices shouted overlapping questions. "How does it feel to win such a historic case? What will you do with the money? Do you think Judge Monroe deserves jail time?" Karoline raised a hand to signal for quiet, her movements deliberate and calm despite the whirlwind surrounding her. When the noise died down enough for her to speak, she took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about me," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the sea of people. "It's about holding those in power accountable. No one should ever have to go through what I've been through, and I hope this verdict sends a message that justice can prevail, no matter how difficult the fight may seem." Her words drew applause from some members of the crowd while others continued snapping pictures or jotting down notes. Karoline scanned the faces around her, searching for any sign of Judge Monroe. She didn't see him, but she knew he wouldn't take this lying down. Men like him rarely did. Still, for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of triumph. She had won, against all odds. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Monroe remained seated long after everyone else had left. His usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a simmering anger that twisted his features into something almost unrecognizable. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he replayed the verdict in his mind. How dare they? How dare she? He had worked decades to build his career, to earn respect and admiration, and now this woman had torn it all apart. Monroe stood abruptly, knocking over a glass of water in the process. He didn't bother to clean it up. Instead, he stormed out of the courtroom, ignoring the curious glances of the few remaining court staff. As he walked briskly down the hallway, his mind raced with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't let this stand. He wouldn't. Later that evening, Karoline returned to her modest apartment in Chicago. It was a cozy space, filled with books and plants, offering a much-needed refuge from the madness of the day. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch, staring out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. But as she sipped her drink, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short and cryptic. Justice has many faces. Karoline frowned, staring at the screen. Was it a prank? A warning? Whatever it was, it sent a chill down her spine. She set the phone aside and tried to shake off the unease creeping into her thoughts. Winning the lawsuit didn't mean the battle was over, not entirely. There would always be people who resented her victory, who wanted to see her fail, but she refused to let fear dictate her life. Not anymore. Little did she know, the real storm was only beginning. The days following their visit to Margaret Ellis were a whirlwind of activity for Karoline Leavitt and Daniel Carter. Armed with the information Margaret had provided, they worked tirelessly to piece together a strategy that would expose Judge Harold Monroe's plans before he could act on them. The stakes were high. Monroe wasn't just trying to discredit Karoline. He was attempting to dismantle everything she had fought so hard to achieve. Every decision they made felt like it carried the weight of her future. Karoline spent hours poring over documents in Daniel's office, her eyes scanning lines of legal jargon and financial records. Margaret's admission about Monroe's offshore accounts had opened up new avenues of investigation. With Daniel's help, Karoline traced the money trail back to several shell companies linked to Monroe's inner circle. These companies weren't just funding the biker gang harassing her. They were also funneling funds into lobbying groups and media outlets loyal to Monroe. It became clear that his network of influence ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. "This isn't just about you anymore," Daniel said one evening as they reviewed the evidence spread across his desk. "He's using this situation to tighten his grip on the system. If we don't stop him now, he'll keep doing this to other people." Karoline nodded, her jaw tightening. She had always known the lawsuit against Monroe was bigger than herself. But seeing the full scope of his corruption laid bare made her realize how dangerous he truly was. This wasn't just about revenge or ego. It was about power. And men like Monroe didn't let go of power easily. Their first step was to leak the information to trusted journalists. Daniel reached out to Sarah Klein, an investigative reporter, known for her integrity and relentless pursuit of the truth. Sarah agreed to meet them at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Chicago. When Karoline handed over copies of the financial records and Margaret's signed statement, Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is huge," Sarah whispered, flipping through the pages. "If this gets out, it could bring down not just Monroe but everyone connected to him." "That's the idea," Karoline replied firmly. "But we need to be careful. If he finds out we're onto him, he'll bury this story before it even starts." Sarah promised to verify the documents and publish her findings within the week. In the meantime, Karoline and Daniel focused on filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Board. They compiled every piece of evidence they had, emails, bank statements, surveillance footage, and submitted it alongside a detailed report outlining Monroe's misconduct. It was a risky move. The board was notoriously slow to act, and there was no guarantee they would take the allegations seriously. But Karoline knew it was a necessary step. If nothing else, it would put pressure on Monroe and force him to respond, publicly. As the days passed, Karoline began to notice subtle changes around her. The clicking noises on her phone stopped abruptly, and her mail arrived intact. At first, she thought their efforts might have scared off whoever was targeting her. But Daniel warned her not to let her guard down. If Monroe realizes we're closing in, he might change tactics, he said. Be ready for anything. Daniel's words proved prophetic. One morning, as Karoline left her apartment building, she was confronted by a man standing near her car. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark sunglasses hiding his eyes. His presence sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Can I help you?" she asked, gripping her bag tightly. "You've caused a lot of trouble," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "People are getting tired of it." Karoline's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. "Who sent you?" she demanded. The man smirked and stepped closer. "You should think about dropping this whole thing. Walk away while you still can." Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Shaken, Karoline immediately called Daniel, who rushed to meet her. Together, they filed a police report and increased her security measures, hiring a private guard to accompany her whenever she went out. Despite the added protection, the encounter left Karoline feeling vulnerable. For the first time, she questioned whether she had bitten off more than she could chew. Taking down a corrupt judge was one thing, but dismantling an entire network of corruption? That seemed almost impossible. Rachel Bennett noticed the toll it was taking on Karoline. When they met for dinner later that week, Rachel could see the exhaustion etched on her friend's face. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Rachel said gently. "This isn't your fight alone. Let us help you carry the burden." The pressure was mounting, and Karoline Leavitt could feel it in every corner of her life. The days blurred together as she juggled meetings with Daniel Carter, phone calls with Sarah Klein, and preparations for the Judicial Ethics Board hearing. Each task felt like another brick added to the wall of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Yet, despite the weight, Karoline refused to give up. She had come too far to let Judge Harold Monroe, or anyone else, push her back into the shadows. Sarah's article hit the newsstands first thing Monday morning. The headline was bold and unflinching. "Judge Monroe exposed corruption, blackmail, and a web of lies." The story laid bare the evidence Karoline and Daniel had gathered, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the ties to lobbyists, and media outlets. It included quotes from Margaret Ellis, who had agreed to go on record after much persuasion, detailing Monroe's attempts to recruit her for his schemes. By noon, the article had gone viral, sparking outrage across social media and dominating television news cycles. For a brief moment, Karoline allowed herself to feel a flicker of satisfaction. Her fight wasn't just about personal justice anymore. It had become a public reckoning. People were talking, questioning, demanding answers. But that satisfaction was short-lived. Within hours, Gregory Lane, Monroe's ruthless attorney, released a scathing statement calling the allegations baseless smears designed to tarnish Monroe's reputation. He accused Karoline of orchestrating a conspiracy fueled by greed and vengeance. The smear campaign had begun. Lane appeared on every major talk show, spinning tales of Karoline's supposed ulterior motives. He painted her as an opportunistic liar who had manipulated the legal system to win an exorbitant settlement. Clips of him speaking confidently on camera played endlessly online, accompanied by carefully edited sound bites meant to cast doubt on her credibility. Reporters began reaching out to Karoline again, this time asking pointed questions about her character and motives. Karoline knew she couldn't stay silent. With Rachel's guidance, she held a press conference outside her apartment building. Surrounded by supporters and flanked by Daniel and Rachel, she addressed the growing storm head-on. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "All I wanted was accountability, for myself and for others who have suffered because of Judge Monroe's actions. These attacks aren't going to change the truth." Her words resonated with many, but they weren't enough to silence Monroe's defenders. Critics seized on minor inconsistencies in her story, blowing them out of proportion to discredit her entirely. One tabloid even ran a front-page story claiming she had exaggerated her struggles during the lawsuit, complete with fabricated quotes from unnamed sources. The constant barrage of negativity wore on Karoline, chipping away at her resolve bit by bit. Daniel noticed the toll it was taking. Late one night, as they sat in his office reviewing documents, he leaned back in his chair and studied her face. "You're carrying the weight of the world right now," he said quietly. "But you don't have to do it alone. We're here with you." Karoline managed a weak smile. "I know," she replied. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. If all this effort is really going to make a difference." "It will," Daniel assured her. "Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been wronged by someone like Monroe. You're setting an example. That matters." His words gave her strength, but the battle was far from over. The Judicial Ethics Board hearing loomed ahead, and Karoline knew it would be her chance to confront Monroe directly. Preparing for it was grueling. Rachel drilled her relentlessly, anticipating every question Lane might throw at her and helping her craft clear, concise responses. They rehearsed late into the night, poring over case files and rehearsing testimony until Karoline felt ready, or as ready as she could be. On the day of the hearing, Karoline dressed carefully, choosing a simple yet professional outfit that conveyed both confidence and humility. As she walked into the conference room where the board convened, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves in her chest. The panel consisted of 5 members, each seated behind a long wooden table. Their expressions were neutral, giving nothing away. Across the room, Gregory Lane stood beside Monroe, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp as a hawk's. The proceedings began with opening statements. Lane spoke first, launching into a polished defense of Monroe that dripped with condescension. He dismissed the accusations as politically motivated and accused Karoline of fabricating evidence to support her claims. When it was her turn to speak, Karoline took a deep breath and stepped forward. She looked directly at the panel, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't about politics or revenge," she began. "It's about holding someone accountable when they abuse their power. Judge Monroe has spent years manipulating the system for his benefit, destroying lives along the way. I'm not the only person he's hurt, I'm just the one who decided to stand up." She recounted her experiences, detailing how Monroe's rulings had devastated her financially and emotionally. She described the harassment she endured after winning the lawsuit, presenting the evidence Daniel had uncovered as proof of Monroe's ongoing attempts to intimidate her. Her testimony was raw and honest, leaving no room for doubt about the depth of her suffering. When Lane cross-examined her, he tried to poke holes in her story, twisting her words and casting aspersions on her character. But Karoline remained, composed, answering each question with clarity and grace. She refused to let him rattle her, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was telling the truth. By the end of the hearing, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Even some of the board members seemed visibly moved by Karoline's account. Still, she knew better than to assume victory. Decisions like this took time, and there was always the possibility that Monroe's influence would sway the outcome. As she left the building, reporters swarmed her once again, shouting questions and snapping photos. This time, however, Karoline felt a sense of quiet triumph. No matter what happened next, she had faced her accusers and stood her ground. She had shown the world that she wouldn't be silenced, not by threats, not by lies, and certainly not by fear. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Karoline allowed herself a moment of reflection. The road ahead would still be difficult, and the scars of this fight would linger for a long time. But she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against corruption. And that, she realized, was something no one could take away from her. In a cold cell far away, Judge Harold Monroe stared at the wall, his mind racing. He had underestimated Karoline Leavitt, and now he was paying the price. But as he sat there, plotting his next move, he vowed silently that this wasn't the end. Not while he still had allies willing to fight for him. For now, though, Karoline had won this round, and that was something neither of them would forget. The days following the verdict felt surreal for Karoline Leavitt. She woke up each morning expecting everything to return to normal, but life wasn't that simple. The world outside her apartment buzzed with excitement over her victory. News. Outlets replayed clips of her courtroom speech, calling her a symbol of courage and resilience. Friends and strangers alike sent messages congratulating her on taking down someone as powerful as Judge Harold Monroe. But inside, Karoline struggled to find peace. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right. At first it was small things easy to dismiss. Her mail started arriving torn open, envelopes ripped carelessly along the edges. Letters from her bank, utility bills, even personal notes from friends showed signs of tampering. Karoline told herself it could be a mistake by the postal service, but deep down she knew better. Then there were the noises at night. Clicking sounds came from her phone when she wasn't using it, faint but noticeable in the quiet of her apartment. She turned off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth before bed, thinking maybe her devices were malfunctioning, but the clicks persisted. One evening, after returning home from grocery shopping, Karoline found her car tires slashed. Both front tires were completely deflated, jagged cuts running across the rubber. She stood in the parking lot staring at the damage, her heart pounding. Was this coincidence? Or was someone trying to send her a message? She called a tow truck and spent hours waiting, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Rachel Bennett, her lawyer, noticed the change in Karoline almost immediately. When they met for coffee a few days later, Rachel leaned across the table and fixed her with a concerned look. "You're not okay," she said bluntly. "What's going on?" Karoline hesitated, unsure how much to share. She didn't want to sound paranoid or overly dramatic. But Rachel had been with her through every step of the lawsuit, and she trusted her implicitly. Slowly, Karoline recounted the strange occurrences, the tampered mail, the clicking noises, the slashed tires. Rachel listened carefully, her expression growing darker with each detail. "This isn't paranoia," Rachel said finally. "You took down a very powerful man, Karoline. People like Monroe don't go quietly. He has allies, resources, and probably a lot of anger right now. You need to be careful." Karoline nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Part of her still hoped it was all just bad luck, an unfortunate streak of coincidences. But another part of her knew Rachel was right. Winning the lawsuit hadn't closed the book on this chapter of her life. It had only opened a new one. Determined to protect herself, Karoline decided to hire a private investigator. A friend recommended Daniel Carter, a seasoned professional known for his discretion and attention to detail. Daniel was in his late 40s with short-cropped hair and a calm demeanor that put people at ease. When Karoline met him at his office, he listened intently as she explained her concerns. Unlike others who might have dismissed her fears, Daniel took her seriously. "I'll look into it," he promised. "But I need you to stay vigilant. If someone is targeting you, we need to figure out why, and fast." Over the next few weeks, Daniel worked tirelessly to uncover any leads. He reviewed security footage from Karoline's building, traced her phone activity, and even interviewed neighbors to see if anyone had noticed suspicious behavior. At first, his efforts yielded little more than dead ends. Then, one night, while reviewing surveillance tapes from the parking garage where her car tires were slashed, Daniel spotted something unusual. A shadowy figure wearing a hoodie lingered near Karoline's vehicle moments before the incident occurred. Though the image was grainy, Daniel managed to zoom in enough to identify a distinctive tattoo on the person's wrist, a snake coiled around a dagger. With this clue in hand, Daniel began digging deeper. He cross-referenced the tattoo design with local databases and eventually traced it back to a biker gang operating on the outskirts of Chicago, known for their loyalty to wealthy clients willing to pay top dollar. The gang specialized in intimidation tactics, vandalism, harassment, and worse. It didn't take long for Daniel to connect the dots. Someone, likely Judge Monroe, had hired them to make Karoline's life miserable. Armed with this information, Karoline felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't let fear control her, not after coming so far. Together, she and Daniel devised a plan to expose whoever was behind these threats. They needed concrete evidence, something undeniable that would force the truth into the open. And Daniel had an idea about where to start. Through his contacts in law enforcement, Daniel learned that Margaret Ellis, a retired prosecutor, had once worked closely with Judge Monroe during his early career. Now living quietly in a small Ohio town. Margaret rarely made headlines anymore, but records showed she'd recently received large sums of money deposited into her account from offshore sources linked to Monroe. It was a long shot, but Karoline and Daniel agreed it was worth investigating. They drove to Ohio together, the trip giving them time to talk strategy. Karoline admired Daniel's calm confidence, his ability to think several steps ahead. For his part, Daniel respected Karoline's strength and resilience. Despite everything she'd been through, she refused to back down. When they arrived at Margaret's modest home, a cozy cottage surrounded by tall trees, Daniel knocked on the door. Margaret answered cautiously, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun. She recognized Karoline instantly and frowned. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone wary. "I need your help," Karoline replied, "and I think you know why I'm here." After some hesitation, Margaret invited them inside. Over tea, Karoline laid out what she knew, or suspected, about Judge Monroe's involvement in the recent string of threats. Margaret listened silently, her face unreadable. When Karoline finished speaking, she pulled the anonymous letter from her purse and slid it across the table. "Does this mean anything to you?" she asked. Margaret stared at the note for a long moment before sighing heavily. "Monroe contacted me a few weeks ago," she admitted reluctantly. "He wanted me to keep tabs on you, said he needed someone he could trust to gather information." Karoline's stomach tightened, so her suspicions were correct. "Did you agree?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "No," Margaret replied quickly. "I couldn't bring myself to do it, not after everything I've seen him do, but—" She trailed off, looking uneasy. "But what?" Daniel prompted gently. Margaret hesitated again before continuing. "He mentioned appealing the ruling, claimed he found loopholes in old statutes that could overturn the verdict, and he talked about discrediting you publicly, accusing you of fabricating evidence, lying under oath, anything to ruin your reputation." The room fell silent as Karoline absorbed this revelation. She had expected resistance from Monroe, but hearing the extent of his plans left her shaken. Still, she forced herself to remain composed. "Thank you for telling us," she said to Margaret. "We'll make sure the truth comes out." On the drive back to Chicago, Karoline and Daniel discussed their next move. They had enough information to expose Monroe's schemes, but timing was critical. If they acted too soon, they risked tipping him off. If they waited too long, he might succeed in tarnishing Karoline's name beyond repair. In the end, they decided to strike preemptively, releasing the evidence they had gathered to the press and filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Board. As they pulled into the city, rain began to fall, streaking the windshield with rivulets of water. Karoline stared out the window, watching the lights blur together in the distance. For the first time since the lawsuit ended, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Justice wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would still be difficult. But she had allies now, people who believed in her cause and were willing to fight alongside her. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. The days following the Judicial Ethics Board hearing felt like a strange limbo for Karoline Leavitt. The panel had promised a decision within 2 weeks, but waiting was excruciating. Every morning she woke up expecting news, only to find silence. The world outside seemed to move on as if nothing monumental hung in the balance, while Karoline's life remained suspended in uncertainty. In the meantime, the public debate raged on. Supporters rallied behind her, sharing stories of their own encounters with corruption and injustice. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #Stand with Karoline and #Justice for All, turning her fight into a symbol of hope for others who had been wronged. But the backlash continued too. Critics, fueled by Gregory Lane's relentless spin, accused her of orchestrating a witch hunt against an innocent man. The division grew deeper, with people choosing sides based on emotions rather than facts. Karoline tried to stay focused. She spent her days working closely with Rachel Bennett and Daniel Carter, preparing for whatever came next. They knew Monroe wouldn't go down without a fight, and his allies were already mobilizing. Lobbyists tied to Monroe began pushing legislation that would limit accountability for judges, framing it as a measure to protect judicial independence. Media outlets loyal to him published op-eds questioning the fairness of the ethics board process itself. It was clear, if they lost this battle, the ripple effects could undermine justice systems far beyond Chicago. Despite the chaos, Karoline found moments of peace in small things, walking through the park near her apartment, sipping coffee while watching the sunrise, or talking to friends who reminded her why she started this fight in the first place. One evening, she met up with Margaret Ellis for dinner. Margaret had agreed to testify before the ethics board, risking her own reputation to expose Monroe's misconduct. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, they talked about the toll such battles took, not just on those fighting, but on everyone caught in the crossfire. "You're stronger than you think," Margaret said at one point, her voice soft but firm. "I've seen what happens when good people give up. Don't let them win." Her words stayed with Karoline long after the meal ended. Strength wasn't always about charging forward. Sometimes it was about holding on when everything inside you wanted to let go. Finally, the day arrived. A letter from the Judicial Ethics Board arrived in Karoline's mailbox late in the afternoon. Her hands trembled as she opened it, scanning the neatly typed words. When she reached the conclusion, tears welled up in her eyes. The board had ruled unanimously in her favor. Judge Harold Monroe was permanently disbarred and recommended for criminal prosecution on multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. Relief washed over her like a tidal wave, followed quickly by disbelief. After months of struggle, years of pain, and countless obstacles, it was finally over, or so she hoped. She called Rachel and Daniel immediately, sharing the news with voices trembling from emotion. Both were ecstatic, congratulating her not just for winning, but for enduring the unimaginable to get here. Within hours, the verdict became public. News outlets exploded with coverage, celebrating Karoline's victory as a landmark moment for accountability in the justice system. Protesters gathered outside courthouses across the country, demanding reforms inspired by her case. For the first time in what felt like forever, Karoline allowed herself to feel a sense of triumph, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever felt powerless. But even as the world celebrated, Karoline couldn't shake the lingering feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Corruption didn't exist in isolation. It thrived on networks of influence and fear. Taking down one corrupt judge wouldn't dismantle the entire system overnight. Still, she reminded herself, progress often came in small steps. Each step mattered. Few days later, Karoline attended a community event organized in her honor. Dozens of people showed up, friends, strangers, activists, all eager to thank her for standing up against injustice. As she stood at the podium addressing the crowd, she felt a surge of gratitude. These were the people who had kept her going when the odds seemed insurmountable. Their support reminded her that she wasn't alone. "This isn't my victory," she told them, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "It belongs to everyone who believes in justice, who refuses to stay silent when they see something wrong. We still have a long way to go, but today proves that change is possible. Together we can make it happen." Her speech drew applause, cheers echoing through the room. For the first time in years, Karoline felt a glimmer of optimism. Not because she thought the fight was over, but because she knew she had ignited something bigger than herself. Meanwhile, in a cold prison cell miles away, Judge Harold Monroe sat staring at the wall, his face twisted in anger. He had lost this round, but he wasn't finished. As he plotted his next move, he vowed silently to reclaim his power no matter the cost. Men like him rarely admitted defeat, not completely. Back home, Karoline returned to her quiet apartment, the weight of the past few months finally beginning to lift. She poured herself a cup of tea and settled onto the couch, gazing out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. For now, she allowed herself to rest, to breathe deeply and imagine a future where justice prevailed even if imperfectly. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she had taken the first step, and for now, that was enough.